Number one, Ibble Dibble here. Hello, friends. So I'm still working my way through Harry's ridiculous interviews. I am not mentioning anything from Bunker Harry's 28-point manifesto that he repeats in every single interview he does. If you're curious about that, please check out my last video. This video is about the fresh types of weird that emerged on ITV. There are around 50 claims that made me say, "What?" So let's try to get through some of them. Number one, he claims the palace response to his complaints about him and Meghan not receiving mental health treatment was ignoring them or telling them it's all in your head, which we know is not true. We know he had a therapist he called after his kerfluffle with William. We know that Meghan's mother is a mental health counselor. We know Harry could have called on any of the charities he worked with in the mental health space for a recommendation. But here's how he describes it.
I had conversations, I've written letters, I've written emails, and everything is just, no, this is not what's happening. You're imagining it. And that's really hard to take. And if it had stopped by the point that I fled my home country with my wife and my son, fearing for our lives, then maybe this would have turned out differently.
The issue here wasn't access to mental health. The palace did not limit the couple's access to mental health care. The issue, which I think the palace sniffed out quickly, was Meghan building a paper trail of victimhood. Claim two, Harry says he doesn't want to be a single dad.
And the compassion that I have for him as a parent, having to sit with that for many, many hours, bringing up friends of his, trying to work out how the hell do I break this to my two sons. And I never want to be in that position. Part of the reason why we're here now. I never, ever want to be in that position. I don't want history to repeat itself. I do not want to be a single dad. And I certainly don't want my children to have a life without a mother or a father.
He seems to be saying this to make Meghan's claims of suicidal ideation more believable, but it actually reveals to us something about Harry, that he's in this marriage to win it for whatever reasons, no matter what it takes. And he's willing to do anything. He's willing to lie, embarrass himself, embarrass his family, anything to avoid Meghan divorcing him. It only makes me wonder if she's threatened him with divorce already. Number three, Tom asks Harry about his memory problems.
One of the things I found saddest in the book is the way, as I understand it, it kind of begins with your mother's death because you have a problem with the memories before then. Is that right? You've lost them, and that just seems so sad.
Yeah, no, I lost a lot of memories on the other side of this mental wall. Which again I think is so relatable for so many people who've experienced loss, especially as a youngster. That inability to be able to drag the memories back over. But I think a lot of it was a defense mechanism.
We've all preemptively forgiven him for beatifying his mother, who he was too young to remember. Call me a cynic, but is his lack of memory not an extremely convenient excuse for all the mistruths he's been spewing about himself, his wife, his brother, his father, and what the people's princess would really like, want, and approve of? Claim number four, Harry corrects Tom.
It's a haunting description of really post-traumatic stress disorder, really, isn't it? I mean, that's what the whole early part of this book is.
But I refer to it as post-traumatic stress injury because I'm not a person with a disorder. I know I'm not.
This is interesting because he's pushing away the pillow Tom gently laid out for him to jump on. All the lay people in the audience can see he's clearly disordered, and we're willing to give him a pass if it was PTSD. But with him saying it's not, we're left thinking, so what's wrong with you? There are very few other circumstances that would allow us to forgive you. Weird claim number five. He keeps complaining about being left out of conversations about Diana's funeral and walking behind her casket, whether it was appropriate or not.
There was a lot of conversations that happened around times like that, of which I wasn't part of, and William wasn't part of. He was probably more part of it than I was, but the decision was made for both of us to walk behind our mother's coffin, and there's absolutely no way that I would let him do that by himself. And there's absolutely no way that he would let me do that by myself. If it was role reversal. So, it happened.
I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I take umbrage at him always painting this as a trauma. He's not the first and he won't be the last child to bury a parent. If you're old enough to walk, you walk behind the casket. It's an honor, and it's an honor you only get to perform once for your mother. Also, why would a 12-year-old be part of these conversations? Number 6, Harry thinks he has a stronger grip on the grief process and various mental conditions than he does. I've decided I'm going to make a whole video on why Harry is actually not the best advocate for mental health. So stay tuned for that. I'm obviously not diagnosing Harry, but without getting too deep into it, I know I'm going to. Harry repeatedly relays events and describes his feelings in what I've come to believe is a manipulation strategy meant to convince us he has experienced complex trauma, beginning with his mother's death and leading him to irrationally fear for his family's lives. In other words, he knows we think he's crazy, imagining the British press or public is a threat to his life, and he's faking it anyway.
I think at that point I was looking for evidence that it actually happened, that it was true, but I was also looking for something to hurt, because at that point I was still pretty numb to the whole thing. That was, again, my body, my sort of nervous system just kind of shut down and said, let's not go there.
I used to believe his paranoia and delusion was genuine, but the more times I listen to him robotically describe events and feelings, the more I'm beginning to believe Harry's incomplete psychological healing has been something of an elaborate ruse. Diana's death doesn't sit quite right with me as a typical original trauma for this sort of disorder. This kind of permanent shutdown is most common among people who are regularly abused. Not necessarily physical or violent abuse, but really constant abuse, or otherwise extremely worn down by extremely difficult life circumstances. It can occur in people who have experienced a single extreme trauma, particularly if after the fact they experience events that they wouldn't have prior to the primary trauma as traumatic, or they constantly fear a repeat of a similar trauma. For example, if you are violently attacked on the subway, it may be extremely difficult for you to ride the train again. You might experience fight, flight, freeze reactions. He uses the right words to illustrate this condition. Fleeing for our lives, they were out to destroy us, I don't want history to repeat itself, etc. But he doesn't do so with distress or urgency. He does so with anger and defensiveness.
This all started with them briefing daily against my wife with lies, to the point of where my wife and I had to run away from my country.
I think he knows that the only way his family will ever forgive him for his betrayals is if he can convince them he wasn't in his right mind when he betrayed them. This is likely because in the past they've forgiven him terrible behavior and verbalized to him that they knew he was suffering. Again, I am not diagnosing Harry. I couldn't. But what I'm seeing is something a lot closer to oppositional defiant disorder that he was not treated for as a child than the results of trauma. He easily loses his temper. He likes to argue with and correct people. He refuses to comply with rules and directions. He's easily annoyed. He blames others for his mistakes. He's manipulative. He induces discord in the people around him. He incites other family members to fight with one another, and he'll throw a temper tantrum over a seemingly trivial matter. In fact, H&M both seem to do this. He usually yells and stamps his feet, and she usually kicks and cries. Unfortunately, his family didn't know how to deal with this but to treat them like 5-year-olds and ignore them. When Harry talks about his mental health, I often find myself wondering how much he's really describing his issues, what he's learned and how he's come through them, and how much he's trying to manipulate us. With shiny new words he thinks he's learned, he thinks sound very impressive, but he hasn't truly understood, the use of which is a narcissistic tell. Number 7. So much time is spent discussing Princess Diana's death, the following inquest, etc., in these interviews that I wonder if it's all really intended to cast more aspersions on the royal family and fuel more of these murder conspiracy theories.
Again, there were still so many question marks that were unanswered, especially from the inquest.
Is there anything about that night that you worry is still unexplained, or do you think
there's a lot of things that are unexplained? To sit in the back of a car and have this wonderful Irishman drive me through the tunnel at the same speed, there was no danger of anybody losing control, even after a drink or a couple of drinks. However, almost physically impossible to lose control of a vehicle unless you are completely blinded at the wheel. Then it's really hard to, I guess, understand how some people have come away with the conclusions of that night, and that the people that were predominantly responsible for it all got away with it.
Princess Diana wasn't wearing a seatbelt and her driver was drunk and high. They literally pulled him out of the hotel bar to drive her. French paparazzi following her car were a contributing factor to her death, not the cause. Her drunk, high driver drove into a column. Harry, when people are drunk and high, they can drive straight into trees on their own property at 12 miles per hour before ever making it out of the drive. All those times you drove home from the country tipsy, you got lucky. Number 8, Harry says he believes all Americans remember where they were when Diana died.
Over the last, 5 years, especially the last 2 years, the amount of people that I've met here in America, everyone knows where they were and what they were doing the night my mother died. And I never thought about that at all.
No, we certainly don't. Sorry. This is the second or third of Harry's guesses about how everyone else in the world feels based on the tiny number of sycophants he actually interacts with. It also smacks of Meghan Markle ghostwriter, because this is a storytelling trope in America, where I was the day X happened. I believe it began in my grandparents' generation, with people memorializing where they were the day of Pearl Harbor. And I often hear it used for the day Kennedy was shot, the day Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. On 9/11 is a more recent example. I feel Meghan's hand in this. Number 9. He says the British press and the paparazzi haven't changed when they very obviously have.
So much of the British press who were part of it, who fueled it, said that things would change, but they haven't changed.
Let me quote David Taylor, the CEO of Backgrid Photo Agency, formerly known as Exposure, speaking to Kate Samuelson for a 2017 article in Time magazine. Quote, "I've seen a lot of changes during my time in the industry. These legal Rottweilers now come at us and say things like, we want this, we want that, we want to make sure you don't publish this picture. You now have to be really careful that you're not doing things deemed as harassment or surveillance," end quote. According to Mark Stevens, a media law specialist with the firm Howard Kennedy, who represented James Hewitt when allegations of his affair with Diana first emerged, quote, "People accepted that what happened to Diana was wrong, and as a consequence, new notions of privacy, which had been historically alien to us, were applied. We've experienced a pendulum effect in Britain. We went from a position where there was no privacy law in effect in this country to going completely the other way after Diana's death. People realized the media had overdone it, and we've ended up with highly restrictive privacy laws. Pictures of celebrities on the Côte d'Azur appear regularly in American publications which can't appear here. There's this ridiculous double standard where you can turn up at a Hudson newsstand at the British Airways terminal in New York and buy American editions of publications with images that are not compatible with English law," end quote. I could go on, but I trust you take my point. The fact that he doesn't appreciate this indicates how far out of touch he is from reality and how little he values the free press to balance power in society. Number 10, Harry says he loves his dad because he's his dad and he'll always love him, echoing the sentiments expressed about William in the 60 Minutes interview.
Of course, he's my father. I will always love him.
Pointing out that it's a very clear message you seem to want to get across about how much you do love him.
Exactly. I love my father, I love my brother, I love my family. I will always do. Nothing of what I've done in this book or otherwise has ever been any intention to harm them or hurt them.
He doesn't seem to get that love is not a state, but a habit. You can't say you love someone and treat them poorly. That's not love. That's you lying to yourself and others about who you are, what you do, how you feel, because you're too lazy, cowardly, oblivious, or selfish to admit the truth. I can throw a baby off a building and claim I never intended to harm or hurt it. It was just crying so much. I wanted it to arrive in heaven post haste. Is that love? Is that love if the baby is facing an even worse death? Is that love if the baby is just suffering from a terrible illness, but it will get better eventually? Is that love just because the hypothetical baby throwing me is stupid enough to think so? If Harry wants to get psychological, maybe he should read some of the old school players like Harry Tom to learn more about love as a verb. Okay, thank you for listening to today's rant. I'll be back shortly with the next installment. Toodles! Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.